Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined in the studio at a safe distance by Linda Fabiani, the MSP for East Kilbride. Linda, how are you doing today?
I'm absolutely fine, thank you, Kenny.
And I'm joined at a very safe distance by writer and activist Lizzie Eldridge. Lizzie, how are you doing today?
I'm fine too, thanks, Kenny.
Excellent. Well, we start today, as we always do, with a wee quick update of the coronavirus state of play. So a total of, this is as of yesterday afternoon, today's statistics obviously will be published in a couple of hours. But as of yesterday, a total of 363,239 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 344,594 were confirmed negative. 18,645 tests have been positive. There were 18 new confirmed cases of COVID-19, but another day with no new reported deaths, which means that the number of people who have tested positive for the virus and died in Scotland still stands at 2,491. And this would have been obviously on Friday night. 260 people were in hospital, 3 of whom were in intensive care. So just very quickly, Linda, how are you feeling about where we are with the coronavirus just now?
I'm worried because it hasn't gone away. I think what is relatively positive news for Scotland over the last wee while, I worry that some level of complacency creeps into that. I think we have seen in the north of England, for example, we have seen a bit of complacency there, and we know that lockdown has been reintroduced for certain communities and areas. So I'm a bit worried that people think things are getting better. So we have to remain very, very vigilant. I worry about further outbreaks in Scotland. We've had a couple. I think we have to face it with a bit of trepidation.
Yeah, Lizzie, are you feeling complacent about the state of play with the virus just now?
No, I feel exactly the same as Linda. And I actually find this phase more difficult than lockdown, because it's not exactly certain, or I don't feel certain, what we can and can't do. Yesterday I went on public transport for the first time, and that was kind of weird. I saw a woman on the subway who didn't bother putting a mask on. She was with 2 guys with masks, and she only put her mask on inside the subway train. You kind of think, what's going on here? I went into town for the first time. I found that weird. I think we're quite a dangerous place. I agree. I think there's a lot of complacency, maybe some misunderstanding.
Yeah.
I think we're in quite a peculiar place and quite a precarious place.
Yeah. Well, we all have to keep the heat, as we have been told. But a group of people who appear to have lost the heat this week are the Scottish Tory party. Jackson Carlaw quit very suddenly. I don't think anybody was expecting that, perhaps not even Jackson Carlaw. And already we seem to be preparing for the coronation of Douglas Ross. So, Linda, coming to you first on this one. Why do you think Jackson Carlaw resigned? Was he really as bad as some people have tried to make out?
Well, I was there on Thursday. When we had the First Minister's statement and Jackson Carlaw's response, and he was pretty grim, pretty awful. I thought he was humiliated, but I was still really shocked. By the time I got home and had a look, he'd resigned, so it was a bit of a shocker. Why has he resigned? Well, we have seen all the reports of being told to go, and it's all very, very strange. I've tried to look at it from a different angle. I mean, I think back to when Jackson Carlaw first started speaking about coronavirus and the measures we were taking. He was very, very supportive of our First Minister, and I know she appreciated that because she said so many times. I remember that Jackson was pro-Europe and disappointed at the Brexit scenario. I would like to think that Jackson Carlaw is a fairly decent man who just found it too difficult to keep speaking against his principles, and that this started to show in his performance. So I think there's a bit of, yes, he's been told to go, But I also think there's a bit of that's as a result of him not being as on message as perhaps people thought he should be in his own party. But I'm really puzzled about what's happening, because literally within minutes of Jackson Carlaw resigning, we're suddenly told that the heir apparent is Douglas Ross and that Ruth Davidson's going to be running the show in Holyrood. And I'm thinking, yeah, wait a minute, they've got 2 deputies sitting in Holyrood. They've got Annie Wells and they've got Liam Kerr. How do they feel about that? Because basically what's being said is you guys are pretty rubbish and you're not capable of any of this, and we have to bring in some saviour from Westminster.
Yeah.
Who chose to leave Holyrood and go down to Westminster. So it's all very, very strange. I'm
going to come to almost all of those points. But Lizzie, obviously you're not in the Parliament, you're not quite as close to this. How has the way the Tories have acted in the last few days come across to you?
So you're going to say in the last years. To be honest, although I'm a very political animal and active as an activist, I hate parliamentary politics. I really, really don't like it. So I look at what the Tories are doing and I don't pay much attention because I'm not interested in parliamentary politics, but more specifically, when it involves the Conservatives, particularly the Scottish Conservatives, I can't really register much interest apart from the state.
Okay, fair enough. With Douglas Ross, he as you said, he quit Holyrood after about a year in order to go to Westminster. He then resigned from a post in the Scotland office over the Dominic Cummings affair, and then Number 10 supposedly described him as a nobody, so it didn't matter that he had resigned. And now suddenly it seems that he has the entire party machinery behind him. What do you make of that particular question?
Also, when you look further back in his career, I understand that he resigned from the council group that he was on as well, up in Aberdeenshire, I think. So he seems to have a history of walking out. I think what it shows is a complete lack of confidence in the MSPs that are sitting in Holyrood on behalf of the Conservatives. And I think that must be pretty hard to take for some of these people sitting there. I don't know, I just think it's complete disarray. And it reminds me actually of, remember Joanne Lamont in Labour, and then Jim Murphy came in and Joanne was dumped from heading up the branch office. Jim Murphy came in and, well, that didn't save them. So it's a very similar scenario. It's basically saying, we don't have confidence in any of you guys up there. Get back in your box and we'll impose leadership from outside. And
I mean, you make that point there about the kind of the Joanne Lamont resignation. Yeah. I mean, we all remember that when she referred to being a branch office and having things imposed on her by head office. Michelle Ballantyne made very much this point that this had been, that even though she was glad to see the back of Jackson Carlaw, she felt that he had been effectively sacked by head office and that this had gone completely over the heads of the MSPs. They found out about it from a press release. Is this just an expression of the kind of Westminster-centric, London-centric attitude that the Tories have towards Scotland?
Michelle Ballantyne was pretty vicious in that interview on the BBC 9. I was stunned watching it, and it was really annoying because I was on my own, so I had nobody to bounce things off. But yeah, and a complete lack of loyalty, first of all, to her party, but anger. I could see the anger in her about the way the MSP group had been treated, and I just can't imagine a scenario where something as major happens in my own group, where the first we would hear about it would be a press release. Yeah. It just, to me, shows complete disunity right across the board, and I'm waiting with interest to see what happens, because there must be a lot of upset people sitting in the Holyrood benches.
No doubt. So Lizzie, I mean, as you said, you're not a great fan of the parliamentary side of things, but Douglas Ross is being proclaimed as the man who's coming to Scotland to save the Union. Do you get the feeling that a change of leadership for the Tories is going to make a big difference to the way the independence debate has been going?
Oh, well, okay, I'm speaking just as a person as opposed to a professional.
Yeah.
I think not. I think Boris Johnson has done us in Scotland a favour. I mean, he's so disliked up here. And the recent Russia report as well, showing Russian interference with the referendum, whatever the nature of that interference, whatever the reasons behind it, nevertheless, I think the fact there was interference, it gives us a bigger push to have another referendum. And I think it will make the cause for independence stronger again. Mm-hmm. This is my hope.
And kind of the same question to you. Do you think that a change of leadership is enough for the Tories to be able to at least get their message across better than they were with Jackson Carlaw?
I don't believe so. I think everyone knows what their message is. Their message is stop the SNP at all costs. Ergo, stop Scottish independence. Nobody's in any doubt of what their message is. So I don't think it will make any difference. I think everything that Boris Johnson does just makes the case stronger for independence. Lizzie mentioned the Russia report there. When you look, behind some of the headline stuff in the Russia report, and you see the influence that Russian oligarchs have, in the House of Lords in particular, who are not accountable, non-elected, not accountable. When you look at that, and then you look at the latest honours list from Boris Johnson, not only is there nepotism and increasing the number of unelected lords, but there's also been an honour given, to one of the Russian chaps. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Lebedev. So people just don't have confidence in what Boris Johnson is doing. They don't have confidence in the Conservatives. So I don't think it'll make any difference whatsoever what they do up here.
And now one of those newly ennobled people is, of course, Ruth Davidson, the last saviour of the Union. Now, Ruth Davidson obviously was more successful than most as Tory leader, was certainly very popular with the media, seemed to be very popular with Tories in London as well, with the exception of Boris Johnson, who she clearly didn't get along with. She resigned as leader of the Tories in Scotland because she wanted to spend more time with her family. And now she's taken a gig in London in the House of Lords, and is allegedly going to be Douglas Ross's right-hand man in Parliament right up until the election next year. Is a Ruth Davidson comeback going to have any impact on politics in Scotland, do you think?
I don't believe so. I mean, what she's doing in her family life and how she works that out is up to her. I wouldn't comment on that. But no, I don't think it'll make any difference whatsoever. I think people have had the Ruth Davidson period. It's passed. I think all it shows is the lack of talent that they actually have in Scotland, and people will see right through that. And I don't think it'll make any difference whatsoever.
And just before we move on from Douglas Ross, I wanted to mention something he said. He was interviewed a while back and asked what he would do if he was made Prime Minister for the day. Yeah. And he replied that the first thing he would do would be to crack down on gypsies and travellers. Lizzie, what do you think it says about politics in this country that it's acceptable for a politician to think that that's the most important priority facing us?
It's not only that he thinks it's the most important priority, it's the fact that he thinks he can say it. And the fact that he does say it, I think that's terrifying. I think the level of discourse in this country is, in terms of racism. I mean, look at Boris Johnson, for example. He refused to give the knee. No, I mean, I think it's outrageous. Yeah,
Linda, what was your kind of feeling when you see something like that?
I was disgusted when Douglas Ross said that. I've also been pretty disgusted when it's been said by other, particularly Conservative councillors, along the same lines. Not just Conservatives, though. I can't remember who said that there was a report, it might have been Human Rights Commission, I'm not sure, Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who said that prejudice against gypsy travellers was the last bastion of acceptable racism. And I've often found that, that wonderful culture that gypsy travellers have brought to our history and our community, and it's the othering. And I get really, really frustrated when I hear it. Since I went into Parliament 20 years ago, I think there's been 3 studies into gypsy travellers and the discrimination that they face. Not a lot happened. This time, I think there are going to be changes. There's been an action plan drawn up and it's being monitored very, very closely. I think there's a real will there to face some of the discrimination, whether it be in education, whether it be in medical services, etc. But that kind of talk, I just find absolutely disgusting, and it should be called out and not countenanced in any way.
Yeah, well, it's particularly appropriate that we do mention that today, because today is Roma Holocaust Memorial Day. It's known as the Porajmos in Roma language. Somewhere between 220,000 and 500,000 Roma people were killed in the Holocaust, and today is the anniversary that they used to mark it, because on the night of the 2nd of August in 1944, almost 3,000 Roma, mostly women, children and elderly people, were killed at the so-called Gypsy family camp at Auschwitz. Obviously, hundreds of others died in other locations, but that was a particularly kind of momentous night. Linda, how do you feel kind of when you hear these kind of numbers, this side of the Holocaust that we don't think about quite as much as we do about the murder of Jews?
Yes. How do I feel? It's an overwhelming sadness that these things happened, in the lifetime of many people that we still know and we still interact with. Sadness that it's not always recognised, and a sadness that people don't seem to care particularly. It's really difficult for the Roma, spread across so many countries in mainland Europe and, and now people here. They just seem to get such a tough deal all the time, You get folk like that, Douglas Ross and others, really hammering into them with no understanding and no wish to understand where that comes from, the culture it comes from, the decades and probably centuries of discrimination that comes from. And I remember being quite shocked myself, being in Eastern Europe some years ago now, and just reading the local English language newspapers and the overt discrimination that was still going on against the Roma populations. I was absolutely horrified by it. And when you look at some of the rhetoric of some of the governments in mainland Europe that are going right-wing, we're going back the way. And we cannot allow that to happen in Scotland. We've got to keep pushing that everyone's got to get an equal crack of the whip here. And that any form of discrimination is just not acceptable. And we've got to keep calling it out.
And Lizzie, how's your perception of this? I mean, you've travelled a bit in Europe, you've lived in other parts of Europe. Do you see any of this same kind of racism against the Roma as you've been around other parts of Europe?
Well, the main place that I lived in Malta, and that's not an issue there because there's not a Romani community. There's racism in Malta, but not against Romanis, just because of how it is. What I did read this morning that really kind of affected me was that a group of Romanis resisted and rebelled and attacked the Nazi guards, and the majority of the strongest people involved were women and children, who of course were later. And it just breaks your heart. What breaks my heart too is what Linda's saying, is that what's happening now is going back to the period before the Second World War, where fascism, extreme right-wing groups, populism, etc., is pretty rampant. And just look and you say, God, we learn anything, and where are people's humanity? That should progress backwards. I feel like it's going backwards, obviously not for everybody, but on a large scale, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, it's something we have talked about on this show before, the sense that as the generation that actually fought in the war have left us, we seem to have forgotten a lot of those really important lessons. So we do send out our best wishes to all the Roma people who live here in Scotland and elsewhere. We certainly will try not to forget and not to let other people forget here. But we move on now, and this week documents have been released as part of a legal case which appear to show evidence that the special forces in the British military, senior officers in the British military, were aware of allegations of war crimes by various groups in the SAS and SBS. This lawsuit is being brought by a gentleman named Saifullah Kharib Yar about the deaths of 4 of his family who he says were unlawfully killed by British forces in February 2011 in Afghanistan. Now, Linda, obviously we can't go into great detail on this specific case, but what do you make of this idea that there were effectively SAS death squads going round to Afghanistan in the middle of the night and killing innocent civilians, including children?
Absolute horror. It was like Lizzie said earlier, have we forgotten? And one of the ways that we have to keep pushing ourselves not to forget is to take such allegations seriously and investigate them. They have to be investigated. The truth has to come out. We blandly, every time we carry out remembrance services, we say, lest we forget. Mm-hmm. And, in our own culture, in our own country, that is probably more aimed at those who lost their lives in our own countries. But it's not just about that. It's lest we forget the many, many thousands, millions of people that have died worldwide in wartime, in peacetime even, by all sorts of internal oppression, etc. We should never forget. And the only way to be able to not forget is to remember what we have done. So this report has come out. It has to be investigated and not swept under the carpet, but upfront investigated. The truth's got to show.
Yeah. Lizzie, obviously, we're going to get on to discussing another death that obviously was not well investigated initially, that you've had some involvement with. We are going to talk about that shortly. What do you make of this idea that the army knew that there were allegations and chose not to investigate? Is that something that surprises you at all?
No, not really. I find it deeply disturbing that there are so many blind eyes turned to so many atrocities all over the world. When you were talking about that, I was thinking of Abu Ghraib, which of course did come out, and it was horrific, and it was dehumanization, visually, visibly, physically, obviously, and psychologically for the people concerned. And you look at this, man, what are we as human beings capable of? And going back to about lest we forget, I agree totally. Lest we forget is about, let's keep remembering what we've done so we don't do it again. And yet somehow we do.
What do you think is behind that kind of urge to forget that we seem to have?
That's a big question. Money, greed, power. The whole idea of living for today, but it's about live for today, party today, and who cares what happens tomorrow. I don't know where it comes from, but it seems to be quite a dominant way of being in the world. Yeah. Fun.
Well, speaking of money, power and corruption, we do move now to look at Malta. And Lizzie, I know you have taken a very deep interest in the Daphne Caruana Galizia case. Now, this week we saw Melvin Thuma, who is one of the middlemen in this case, man accused of recruiting the people who actually planted the bomb that killed Daphne Caruana Galizia, and he appears to have attempted suicide while under 24-hour police guard in shortly before he was due to be giving evidence. Do you want to tell us a wee bit about where the case has been recently and what you've made of these most recent developments?
I was trying to look through it all this morning because so many things happen in Malta on a daily basis, it's difficult to keep track. But just to kind of summarise, Melvin Thuma was arrested last November, and he was arrested on charges of money laundering. And he was apparently tipped off that he was going to be arrested as well by none other than the recently resigned head of police. This is all coming out now. There are two parallel things happening. Public inquiry, which was set up, Daphne Caruana Galizia's family pushed for it, the Council of Europe pushed for it, NGOs and pressure groups pushed for it, and it was set up to investigate whether the state could have done anything. One of the reasons anyway was to see if the state could have prevented the assassination. So this is going on at the moment, as is what's called the compilation of evidence against Jorgen Fenech, who's the man charged with masterminding the assassination. So Melvin Thuma was arrested last November, and he is what's called the self-confessed middleman. So he was the guy going between Jorgen Fenech and the people who detonated the bomb, but other people are involved as well. So he was given a pardon last November by the then Prime Minister, who's also incriminated assassination. So it's a bit of a gross can of worms. So Melvin Thuma made recordings, which include his conversations with Jorgen Fenech. They include reference to McBride, the ex-Prime Minister's right-hand man, who's still walking around freely. They include references to Joseph Muscat, the ex-Prime Minister who resigned last November under a cloud of suspicion about his role in the assassination. So Melvin Thuma is a crucial person. He's the main state witness for the prosecution. So a week last Tuesday, about 9 o'clock, he's been with his lawyer all day prior to a very important court hearing. And he is discovered inside his house. His house is surrounded apparently by police. And he's discovered with about 6 stab wounds in his stomach, stab wounds in his chest, injuries to his kidneys. And then at the end of this, he decides to slit his throat. His neck was in 2 parts. The police immediately said it was attempted suicide. And they gave the name as well, which apparently is unheard of in an attempted suicide case. So he went to hospital, having attempted suicide in what was described as an extremely unusual way. Was in a critical condition, obviously. Was interviewed while he was there. Apparently there were big men with big guns in that hospital. That's a public hospital he was in. And he was giving eye signals, apparently, and hand gestures to communicate. I mean, this is a man who really theoretically should have died. The Saturday after this attempted suicide occurred, he writes a letter. I mean, a letter is a standard kind of melodramatic, artificial device. A letter, here's the letter, in which he says he attempted suicide and the reasons for doing that was because of remorse and because he felt his evidence wasn't being seen as credible. And he also scribbled a second point, was to say, you know, Jorgen Fenech got him into all this. Now, this kind of lets off the hook, potentially, or the idea is, lets off the hook Keisha Kembry, the ex-Prime Minister's right-hand man, and the Prime Minister. It is a very, it is really gross, it's macabre, and whereas you think, of course, he was the obvious target, you didn't really think they would do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's
Really
a
horrible.
fairly messy case at every level, as you say. People all the way up to the former prime minister and his chief of staff are potentially implicated in the case. How is Malta as a country kind of coming to terms with this now that Muscat has resigned, Schembri resigned, Conrad Mitzi resigned, who was one of the other cabinet members who's been implicated in some of these shady dealings? How is the country responding with new leadership and this investigation finally starting to get somewhere?
Well, whether it's starting to get somewhere or not, the public inquiry is definitely getting places. I mean, you've had politicians, government ministers, the Attorney General, Police Commissioner, all the kind of top brass, just telling us what we already knew. That the police did nothing to investigate crimes, economic crimes, serious economic crimes involving politicians and politically exposed people. Did nothing. So the public inquiry is kind of revealing all this stuff, and it's very difficult to listen to, because what you realise is, if the police had not been state captured, and if the police had been doing their job, Daphne Caruana Galizia would still be alive today. And that's an awful thing, and especially awful for her family.
Yeah.
So how is Malta responding to the new continuity prime minister? If there was an election tomorrow, the new continuity prime minister would sit in.
And what are your kind of hopes about what happens next? As you say, you're not convinced that everything is yet back on the level. Are the people going to insist that justice is done, or do you think that is possible even in Malta as it stands just now?
Oh, absolutely, and the pressure is still there. We've had a lot of media freedom NGOs, for example, Reporters Without Borders, Scottish PEN, part of it, PEN International as well, ECPMF. They've been there, Reporters Without Borders and ECPMF have been there monitoring proceedings in the court. In fact, one of the main people in Reporters Without Borders was out there when Melvin Toma was found allegedly having tried to commit suicide by slitting his throat, etc. So there's a lot of international pressure on Malta. But what has happened, because Melvin Toma has literally been silenced, is that it puts the investigation, and the people who are incriminated are walking around free.
And so what is the time scale now? Do you have any idea on when things might move forward?
It's day by day. I mean, I have no idea. I don't know.
And now, Linda, obviously this is a fairly horrific case. What does it say about organisations like the EU that a member state is able to have this kind of corruption at the highest level, the police not doing their jobs, a journalist allegedly assassinated with potential involvement by politicians? What is the role of the international community in this kind of situation?
Well, do you know, that was fascinating, because we're not up to date in it generally. I often think about that myself, Kenny. From what's still happening in Catalonia, for example, what some of the stuff that's been happening in Hungary and in Poland and in Malta, I sometimes ask myself that very same question. It's that thing about the EU, which is about the sovereignty of the nation state and not interfering internally. I always hold on to the hope that behind the scenes discussions are going on. I sometimes get pessimistic about that and think that, to use the earlier expression, blind eyes have been turned. Other times I feel a bit more optimistic about it. What I am really glad about is that you have so many people that are not directly involved in government who are monitoring and reporting. And of course, the wider issue in the Malta? The Malta case is just horrendous. It's just absolutely awful. The fact that it's a European nation makes it even more so, because there should be standards there that people can live up to. But there's a wider issue going on about the persecution of journalists and the acceptance of the persecution of journalists. And Scottish Pen and International Pen, referenced by Lizzie, they had a big campaign about that. I think it was last year's main campaign. And even though I like to think I am quite up to date in some of that kind of stuff across the world, I was really quite taken aback by the increased level of persecution that's going on with journalists just now. And you see it too, even in our own democracies. You see a lessening of the respect given to journalists by those with whom journalists interact on a daily basis. And I find that worrying too. Whether it be, in fact, President Trump, let's not talk about him, but we all know what he says about journalists. But even in the UK just now, we've now got a Prime Minister who's going to employ someone to speak to the journalists rather than himself be accountable. We see journalists from particular publications locked out of press briefings. Now, as a politician, I get frustrated with journalists all the time. Of course I do. But, frustrated or not frustrated, there's a vital role going on there. And whilst I do take offence at some of the mainstream publications we have and their stance and things, we are talking about free speech, we are talking about transparency and accountability. And the role of the investigative journalist is one of the most important roles in our society. And it goes back to that discussion we had earlier about lest we forget. These are the people who are showing up what's going on, lest we forget. And do it again. So I'm really concerned. I mean, the Malta case is just horrendous. And there's been other cases that we all know about, the Saudi Arabian one recently as well, horrendous. But we do have journalists jailed in lots of countries across the world at the moment. And we do have journalists being persecuted at all levels, from really serious persecution right down to a dismissiveness that I find unhealthy. Of course, the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom did once conspire to beat up a journalist. It's not quite on the level of obviously the Daphne Caruana Galizia case, but it's certainly on the same spectrum. But we move on now back to the UK, where the Office for National Statistics announced this week that given the amount of money that has gone into the rail network during the pandemic in order to keep the companies afloat, means that the ONS is now, for the time being, classifying the railways as public sector. Railway workers are now classified as public sector workers, and rail company borrowing is now treated as public sector debt. Lizzie, I'll come to you first on this. This is about as blunt as you can get of nationalising the losses and privatising the profits, isn't it?
Pretty much, although to be honest, I'm not very familiar with this issue. So I'm not sure I'm the right person to come to first. I think Linda might want to speak.
Well, no, I mean, is that just what is it? I mean, how do you respond when you hear something like this? I mean, what kind of reaction do you have to that?
Well, as I say, it's the first I knew about it, Kenny.
I'm sorry. Well, Linda, I'll come to you just now then. What do you make of this?
Well, I'm going to first of all make an admission. Lizzie, the first I knew about it was when Kenny told me 5 minutes before the programme.
Thank you.
I know about as much as you do.
Well, we do try to be first with the news.
I missed this. There's so much going on. But I'll tell you what, this is a mark of things. There is so much going on the surface of politics, and Lizzie talked earlier about party politics, parliamentary politics. there's so much going on at that level that all the big things are getting masked, you know, and myself and politicians and the chattering classes are all running about talking about Douglas Ross and Boris Johnson and troubles in the SNP and all that. Meanwhile, there's really important stuff like this going on. And again, it's a mark of the way we're going, which is those with money seem to get bailed out all the time and the rest of us foot the bill. And I mean, I would like to see, you know, if we're really saying now that the ONS are saying that basically this is a public company because of the level of subsidy and everything else, well, take that as a way for the UK government to move forward and seriously look at Network Rail. I would like to think that that's a sign that says this really does have to be looked at again.
Yeah. I mean, Lizzie, most people, I think, agree that the privatisation of the British rail system was not done very well, that there were a lot of mistakes made in the way that this everything was broken up. It's been wildly unpopular. A majority of Tory voters support renationalising the railways. Do you think there is any possibility that the fact that this has happened now does lead to some reconsideration of how we do rail in this country?
Well, it should do, yes, it should. Whether it will is another matter. I mean, the whole push on privatisation, the railways to, the way universities are run, for example, stems from Thatcher and her push towards privatisation. So it's got a long history and not a pleasant. And I think that nationalised industries are really important, and that's where we should be going back to.
Yeah. Do you think
whether it will happen or not? I don't know.
Do you think, given what's happened during the pandemic, where we've had to kind of pause a lot of the economy and we've started to take a look at things differently, do you think there is scope more generally for a change in the way we look at public transport? There's obviously, lots of green benefits to increasing public transport. Do you think there is scope now for us to start looking at those kind of things as well?
Again, I would really hope so. And I remember right at the beginning of lockdown when people were talking about, this is a way for us to reevaluate how we live and reassess how we live and our priorities and stuff. And thinking, that's a lovely idea. And I hope so. But the reality of going into town yesterday for the first time since, phase 3, I think we're in now, was watching people sitting in bars, trying to get back to the same normality that we had before. And nothing wrong with sitting in bars and stuff, but, let's try and reevaluate the normality that we had before and come through and live in a different, better one. That's my hope.
Yeah. And Linda, obviously there is the possibility now for the Scottish Government to introduce a public sector franchise in Scotland. It doesn't take care of everything. Network Rail is still a separate company, and that poses all sorts of other complications. But do you think there is now scope for the Scottish Government and the UK Government to really start rethinking the whole structure of the economy? That kind of issue about nationalising critical industries.
Absolutely.
Is that a real possibility now?
Absolutely. I think we should be looking at so many things. Now, the Scottish Government had already said pre-pandemic that they were looking at a public sector franchise for the bit of the railway that they are able to control in some way. We've already said we'd look at the model of Lothian buses, for example, for other parts of the country. Publicly owned. So I think there's a real opportunity here. And it does tie in with the green agenda. When I even look at my own constituency, East Kilbride, new town, built for cars, is overwhelmed by cars now. It's time for a shift. When we're talking about commuter belt, we really should be looking at proper integrated public transport, green transport that people use. And I do think there's an opportunity for transport as part of the wider agenda. It's not just about transport, as a way of looking at how we restructure our society. So, Social Justice Commission that was set up by Nicola Sturgeon is looking at a lot of these things at the moment. So I'm pleased about that. But we have to be looking at how that can be actioned rather than just talking about it.
Yeah.
We have to be looking at the constitutional setup. We have to be looking at powers, and ultimately we have to be looking at independence, if to really make Scotland the kind of country that we want it to be.
And Lizzie, we've, as Linda said, there's been a lot of discussion, and as you said as well, there has been a lot of discussion about reshaping the economy coming out of the pandemic. But we have seen from certainly the UK government less enthusiasm for that than maybe we've seen in Scotland and indeed in Wales as well. There's been a lot more kind of advanced talk, a wee bit more kind of far-sighted talk about things. Do you have a lot of hope for the world looking better after the pandemic than it did before?
I think it goes back to the words, lest we forget. You know, it's like the pandemic is not over for one thing. And the talk about a second wave is erroneous, because who has said it's not a second wave? It hasn't finished. So there's a mad scramble to get things back to normal, get the economy up and running, or oven ready, as Boris Johnson might want to say. You know, there is a real opportunity here, but it's not been that long and we're still in it. You know, we haven't come out of the pandemic and by a long way. We're still very much in it. And what worries me is the speed at which especially Boris Johnson, with lifting restrictions in England, I mean, that was just ludicrous. That was dangerous and ludicrous, and is dangerous. So if it's left in the hands of people like Boris Johnson and Trump, then nothing will change. I'm really pessimistic, because I think this is a real opportunity to realise how much damage we've done to our own world because of the ways in which we live. And if we don't change that...
Yeah. Well, we come on now to our last topic of the day. We started with the chaos in the Tory party, and this week, Linda, there's been a wee bit of a stew sheet going on in the SNP. I appreciate this may not be the easiest subject for you to talk about, but we heard for the NEC made a decision about dual mandates and about what an MP would have to do if they wanted to stand for Holyrood. This was widely seen as a way of shutting Joanna Cherry out of running in the Edinburgh Central seat. We also saw James Dornan seemingly blocked out of standing by the introduction of a women-only list for his constituency. Now, that has since been overturned because James had said that he was going to stand again and therefore wouldn't be put in the position of having a women-only list. So he will now be able to stand again. The issue with the £10,000 cost for an MP wanting to shift to Holyrood still stands, though. So first of all, what do you make of how these decisions were presented to the party and the wider public?
Right. First of all, the £10,000 thing that doesn't apply. That was kicked out, I understand. Now, I'm not on the executive. The party has an executive. There's 40 plus people on it that come to these decisions. I understand that because of COVID, because of the executive not being able to meet as they normally would, it's taken a lot longer to discuss these things as would have normally. But basically, what the executive has said is that if somebody who is already an MP wishes to stand for another parliament, then they should stand down for the election period. So you're talking, what, maybe 6-7 weeks or something like that, because we're not having dual mandate. I think, as I said, I'm not in the executive. The reason behind that, I would imagine, is we had a Westminster election in December, just last year, only months ago. We returned MPs to Westminster who are doing a job for the party and the cause at Westminster. We have a Scottish Parliament election coming up. There's been 3 Westminster elections in comparatively recent years. It costs a blooming fortune to run elections, and by-elections cost an awful lot more. So I think this is probably a pragmatic response to, we have 2 sets of parliamentarians, they do complementary jobs, they should be just getting on with their job and getting on with it. And if we had a lot of people dual mandating, we would have a lot of by-elections further down the line that would cost a lot of money. So I actually don't have a big problem with the decision made, because it's been democratically made by the party's executive. And this is what always happens. What also always happens at times of in the run-up to the elections, since the advent of social media, you get social media going wild, you get people who should know better spouting their opinions about party policy to the world. My view is internal party politics are internal party politics. So I just stand by the democratic processes of the party, and if that's what the executive have decided, I may like it, I may not like it, but do you know what? That's a democratic decision. Move on.
And we've heard that this is all part of a great civil war within the SNP. How concerned are you that, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to kind of go into whose side you're on or whatever, but how concerned are you that this narrative is going to affect the party going into an election?
Well, do you know, I've been about for a long time, and I've fought so many elections, and we have this every time there's an election. You know, we have all these, I said earlier that journalists annoy me sometimes. Well, here's a time they annoy me. We have all this speculation about splits in the party and about this and about that. And, well, you know, I would go by our record, because what fundamentally holds the SNP together, regardless of all the other arguments that go on, is an absolute passion for independence. And that's what motivates us. And that's how we'll get there. Now, with the advent of social media, that's become more difficult. And sometimes I think people are speaking to their own wee village. Because I'm pretty sure if I went out in East Kilbride, stopped a random 100 people and said, what about this? They wouldn't know who half the people were that are getting talked about. They would just say Nicola Sturgeon's doing a good job. And they would say whether or not they believe in independence. The rest, I believe, is froth. So, yes, of course, we're a political party that has troubles. You know, there isn't a political party across the UK that doesn't have troubles right now. By the very nature of humanity, you have troubles when you come together. We don't always all agree on everything. No, I think we're pretty sound going into next year's election.
And looking forward to that election, do you think that we will see another independence vote within a reasonable amount of time after that election?
Yes, I do believe so.
Okay. And Lizzie, I know you're probably tearing your hair out listening to all this awful internal party politics. What's your feeling about where the movement towards independence stands in Scotland just now?
As I said quite early on, I think we're in a good position to go for another referendum. I remember Boris Johnson said he was going to try and block it before he even became Prime Minister, which again gives us more motivation to go for it. I think we're in a good position. And I also think our response to the pandemic, ongoing as it is, and not necessarily perfect, but our response in contrast to the things that Boris Johnson has been up to in England also gives us more kind of strength and reason to go ahead and have a referendum.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a pretty good place to end the show. We are almost out of time. So I'd like to thank Linda very much for joining us in the studio, and Lizzie for joining us remotely. I hope we will talk to both of you again very soon. And thank you to you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point in us making these shows if we didn't have an audience. So thank you very much for being with us. If you're able to support us, then we would ask that you please do. If you're able to, do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us to keep producing these kind of programmes and over time to develop more shows We have a lot of plans, but we can only do them with your support. If you're not able to support us financially, we do understand. We know times are tough for a lot of people, especially during the pandemic. But please be aware the shows will always be free to view online. You can go back and look at our entire back catalogue on YouTube if you want to. But the biggest thing you can do to help us is to follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, find us on Facebook, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the videos there, and share the videos around with people that you think might be interested. If there's somebody you know who's always complaining about how rotten the BBC news is, let them know where Broadcasting Scotland is, and hopefully they can give us a try. You never know, maybe they can contribute a couple of quid and save you the bother. And finally, the other thing you can do if you really want to help here is get involved. We have a lot of jobs needing done here at Broadcasting Scotland if we are going to continue to develop. We've talked a wee bit about next year's election. We really want to get people trained up to be out in all the counting centres. We want to have people in the studio to talk and keep things running behind the scenes for a whole night's election coverage. It's a big job, and we are going to need help with that, as well as everything else we want to do here at Broadcasting Scotland. So do please get in touch with us if you've got any interest in getting involved in anything here at Broadcasting Scotland. It's the only way we're going to build the kind of broadcaster that Scotland deserves. But that is absolutely all we have time for this evening. So Gordon will be back with Scotland at 7 tomorrow night. I'll be back at 7 on Tuesday night. But until then, thank you once again to Linda Fabiani and to Lizzie Eldridge. And thank you for joining us again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.